up to 90% of our children with SEN are going to have sleep problems at some time. By removing, we might have to do iPad removal training here before we even put a routine into place, but we have to teach them that coming off that at a certain time is going to be expected. It's not as hard as you think it's going to be. Melatonin isn't always the answer. Parents think that it's going to solve all of the sleep issues. It's not a long-term solution. It's not meant to be given long-term.
On this episode of SENsational, I'm delighted to welcome Helen Rutherford, specialist sleep practitioner from the Sleep Charity. She shares expert advice on helping neurodivergent children and their families improve sleep. We discuss the elements of a good bedtime routine, sensory wind-down techniques, and whether or not co-sleeping could be a solution. A quick reminder before we start, if you're enjoying the podcast, don't forget to like, comment and subscribe. Your engagement helps us to grow and share these vital conversations. Let's begin. Helen, thank you for joining us today to talk about sleep. I'm going to dive straight in with what I think is going to be a quite big question with quite a complex answer. But I wonder if you could tell me, what is the impact of poor sleep on our children?
Okay. This is a really negative sort of rhetoric, if you like. But before people sort of listen and get into this, just know that there is support out there. There is a light at the end of the tunnel, but this just shows how bad it is and how important it is. But the first thing to look at is our behaviour and our child's behaviour. So we look at how we behave when we're around the children and make sure that we're calm when we're doing our nighttime routines. But what tends to happen is when sleep goes on for a long time, or sleep deprivation goes on for a long time, we see changes in behaviour. One of the first things to go is that self-regulation. And I'm sure you felt it yourself if you had a couple of nights bad sleep.
Absolutely.
Yeah. You become, let's just be polite and say, less tolerant of other people. Yeah. You might find that you're arguing more, and it's the same for our children. So they might, the atmosphere in the house might become much more negative. Parents will argue and carers, so relationships start to crumble and the best relationships can fall apart, and we do see relationship breakdown a lot because it's been going on often for years. Siblings start to argue, resentment builds in. You might find that children start arguing more at school, they might get more detentions, they're in trouble more with their teachers. Behaviour is one of the first things that you see slide. And imagine what it's like if it's been going on for years rather than just a few days. We all have bad night's sleep, but we know that it impacts us.
Yeah. And are there any physical impacts that you'd like to enlighten us about?
The immune system is one of the things that is repaired when we sleep, and brain regulation. So it's really, really important for physical health. Repairing injuries, we take longer to repair if we're sleep deprived. There are links now to some forms of Alzheimer's and chronic deep sleep deprivation. There is no area that sleep doesn't impact. Putting things into long-term memory. Our children aren't going to do as well at school. They're not going to be able to focus and concentrate. Their attention's going to fade. So not only are they not taking stuff in, they're also not retaining it because they're not getting enough REM sleep, which is our lighter phase of the sleep throughout the second half of the night.
Thinking about it, it's such a huge topic. And as an occupational therapist, we do think about sleep when we're thinking about the child holistically. But we also think, when we think about the children, about the environment around them. And I imagine lack of sleep probably has an environmental or social impact too, maybe on the parents, not just the child.
One of the things that we hear a lot from parents is they just feel so isolated. They don't go out because they can't get a babysitter. They don't go on holiday because the child's behaviour can be unpredictable or out of control. You hear about neighbours knocking on walls. So not only do the relationships within the household start to crumble, but your community relationships as well. Parents often feel judged. Sleep is a biological need. It's not something we can negotiate. We have to sleep or eventually we'll die. So when parents can't get the children to sleep, they start to worry, wrongly I have to add, that their parenting skills aren't up to scratch. Something is wrong, especially in the playground where everyone seems to be doing such a good job. Why is it me that's struggling? But one thing that I want everyone to take from this is up to 90% of our children with SEN are going to have sleep problems at some time. So it is, you're not alone by far. It's a really, really common problem. And the worry is that depending on the diagnosis, you've probably been told that sleep is going to be something that's going to be impacted. So therefore, you have to expect it. So why, when it comes, if you've been told by perhaps the medical profession that there's nothing that can be done, why would you report it? And that's really, really worrying, because by the time parents come to us, they're in crisis. And we can do so much to stop getting into that crisis in the first place. We can't always solve every sleep issue. We have to be realistic, but we can always improve sleep. And quite often we can resolve it, but we just have to remember we're not looking for perfection sometimes.
So I remember when my children were little, the health visitor was the first person that talked to me about sleep with these brand new babies and what do we do to help them settle to sleep and get them into a good routine. I wonder if you could help us to think about what a good sleep routine would look like for children.
The thought of putting a routine into place when you are overwhelmed by life, because that's the position you get in, can be really difficult to do. But take it slowly, do it at your own pace. And the first thing to remember is a routine is doing something at the same time every day and the same thing.
Yeah.
So planning a routine and sticking to it. And I'll help you as we go through today. Hopefully we'll build up and look at what that looks like in all of its little areas. But plan your routine, stick to it. Drip feed the changes if you can't make it all in one go. Some people are ready to just do the whole lot and go for it. Some people just can't. And the other thing to think about is if your children struggle with change, and a lot of our children, certainly those on the spectrum and those with ADHD, don't like change, you are going to have to drip feed it in, not for your sake, but for their sake.
Yeah.
So making a little change, letting that embed, and then making another change at a pace that you're happy with. And then what happens is you have to go through the transition. I'm sorry, that's sometimes not pretty, but trust the process. Everything that we suggest is research and evidence-based. It's independently evaluated. So please do trust the process. It can take a few weeks to see a change.
Yeah. And I imagine when you're thinking about that process and trusting the process and thinking about diving in, you have to be as ready as you think that your child will be for the changing routine, maybe thinking about your own resilience and what support networks you might have in place before you start these routine changes. Would you agree that that's quite important?
If you have a support network, draw on it. Not everyone is fortunate enough. I work with a lot of families who just say, we've moved over here, we're new to the area, we haven't got friends, we haven't got a networks, a babysitting circle, and our parents are either not around anymore or just not in the area. If you can find a way of just getting a couple of good nights sleep yourself, your resilience will actually be much better. Finding the right time to do it. Some parents say, I'm going to wait till the next school holidays so that other people can have a lie-in if their nights are disrupted. Others will say, I've got to start now. I'm on my knees. I can't do this anymore. Like I said before, don't strive for perfection. If you're looking for that perfect, they'll go to sleep at 7 and they're going to wake up at 7 the next morning. It's unlikely that we're going to meet those needs. Looking for realistic expectations, and you can discuss that. Making sure you know what's in your area. Some authorities have sleep support services. If you're in an area that's commissioned by us, we have a few, not many, but you might be able to get a one-to-one clinic. But looking at resources such as our sleep helpline, so you can speak to someone and they can help you develop a plan. Yeah. Preparing as well, so getting yourself a bedtime box, putting things in that box that your child likes, because we're going to ask them to come off screens and have a screen-free hour. That's really important for quite a few things. A screen can delay the production of melatonin potentially.
Just give us a little bit of an insight into what melatonin is, sorry, just in case we don't know.
Okay, so melatonin is the sleepy hormone our brain makes just before we're about to go to sleep. And it makes us just feel really sleepy and soporific. And you'll know that you're in that sleepy stage because you'll be fighting sleep. If you, say, for example, sit in a meeting and it's after lunch and you've had a late night and you've got a comfy chair, it's quite warm, it's quite a boring meeting, you might find yourself sort of head snapping. That's when melatonin is rising and you're ready to drop off into sleep. So we're looking to raise that hormone at night. Mm-hmm. But when our children are on screen, sometimes parents will say to us, but that's the only time they're quiet. But if they're interacting, the parts of the brain that are lit up while they're interacting are the same parts as if they were doing it physically. Also, we know that children play violent games, and we don't necessarily see them as violent anymore because they've been around for so long and so many children are on them. But they hype up the addictive parts of the brain as well. So although outwardly they look quiet and focused, when you look at sort of fMRI imaging, their brains are really, really active. Wow. And they're also addicted to them. So imagine you're sat on a sofa reading the best book you've ever read. You're halfway through a chapter and it's a really good chapter. I'm looking at David Walliams' books over there. They're brilliant. Yeah. And if you came and ripped one out of my hand and just said, right, it's bedtime now, I'm probably going to kick off because I've had no processing time and you've just stopped me doing something that I'm really into. So by removing, we might have to do iPad removal training here before we even put a routine into place, but we have to teach them that coming off that at a certain time is going to be expected. It's not as hard as you think it's going to be if you're consistent, and that's what the feedback that we get. We need to give those brains time to decompress. And the other thing we're doing is removing that negative association from coming off a screen and going to bed, because bedtime then is a punishment. Mm-hmm. Yeah. And we want to switch bedtime into a more positive thing. So having a box that has stuff with their interests in, so it could be cars to line up, it could be colouring if they like that, it could be a sensory box if they can't focus on activities. But it just means that they're having that iPad removed or the gaming removed, maybe playing a piece of music so they've got time to process it's coming to an end rather than just ripping it off them. But then they're going on to do something else with mum, dad or carer. So it's good quality one-to-one time. So put a colouring book in there for yourself. It's time to talk. It's time to decompress. You'll listen to some nice relaxing music in the background, perhaps have a little snack. This is where I do tell you to go to Google. Don't often tell parents to look on Google, but go and Google sleepy foods. There's loads on there. Mm-hmm. And we're just having a little snack, not a meal. Mm-hmm. And we're decompressing that brain. We're lowering activity. We're relaxing the body. And that's when the body starts to prepare itself to relax, ready for sleep time. So lowering lights to help raise melatonin, getting the box out, having a snack, going up for a bath or a shower if it doesn't cause sensory overload. Mm. Same for teeth cleaning, hair brushing, nail clipping. Remove them if you're going to undo all that lovely work you've done in the half hour before. Yeah,
that settling time. You don't want to undo that, yeah.
And then into bed. Mm-hmm. Making sure that bedroom area is consistent, because any change in that bedroom environment can trigger nighttime wakings. Okay. And then there'll be other strategies depending on the needs of your child and what's causing the sleep issues. There'll be strategies that we're going to look at in terms of making sure they can sleep. But the routine kind of looks the same, but it's also got to be timed to your child's body clock. Okay. So you could tell me your routine and I could listen to that and think, that's really good. There's nothing I'd change in that. But if it isn't linked to your child's body clock, it's a useless routine, despite being perfect.
And how would you know?
So if your child's going to sleep, say at, let's just pick 11 o'clock out for an example, I wouldn't start the routine initially until about 10 o'clock. Okay. Because bed to that child means messing around, getting up and down, playing up, tossing and turning, frustration, lots of negative thoughts.
Asking for a drink, another cuddle.
Always, yeah, which is why the snack comes in. Yeah. And also, as a parent, sometimes that's the only time you're there 100% for them. Okay. Because when we're downstairs, we're loading the dishwasher, we might be putting the washing on, we're tidying up, we've got other children to tend to. So although you might feel that you're there for your child, it's never 100%. Whereas as we're putting them to bed, it's you, me, and the child in bed, nothing else to do. So that's when they're going to hang on to you, try and keep you there, which is why the bedtime box kind of negates that, because you're giving them that 100% attention downstairs.
I wonder, you touched on it before when you were thinking about negative sensory experiences that might impact that sense of sleepiness. So having your hair brushed, having your nails cut, if that's particularly uncomfortable or dysregulating, that's something we don't want to have in the routine. But are there any sensory strategies that you might consider are helpful in a sleep routine?
There's so many. I could talk for hours on this.
Absolutely, I could too as an OT.
I know, you can interject, you can help me out. I think really you just have to go through all the senses. Mm-hmm. And if your child has sensory needs that have to be met in the day, guarantee they've got to be met at night time.
Mm-hmm. Okay. Mm-hmm.
So if they are light sensitive, we have to make sure their room is really dark. If they are scared of the dark, we're talking one small night light. Their eyes adjust quite quickly. So initially, when you turn the main light out, it feels really dark. But if you just sit with them and chat with them for 5 minutes before going down, their eyes will adjust and then suddenly it's not quite so dark. Mm-hmm. But I have so many families who say they have to have the main light on. And what I do there is we talk about breaking the bulb. So the bulb gets taken out. And one parent just kept saying to her child, oh, it has to come all the way from America. It's a very special bulb and it's caught up in transit.
Parents can be sneaky, can't they?
Absolutely. It's so essential to life. So eventually the child got used to not having that and they had a very low lamp instead. Yeah. Mm-hmm. So by the time that they put the bulb back in, the child didn't need that anymore. Mm-hmm. Another way of doing it is taking the 60 watt out and putting a 40 in. Mm-hmm. Then putting a 20 in and just lowering that way and then changing it up to an uplighter so it's not shining directly until you can transition down to a lamp. Mm-hmm. But ideally, the room needs to be as dark as possible. So blackout blinds for the summer. You might even have to black out the window with material on double-sided Velcro so you control that internal environment. And
from a science point of view, you mentioned earlier that's linked to that melatonin production, isn't it? That a chemical in your body to help you feel sleepy. So very important.
And in our Western lifestyles, we don't have sunset anymore because we've got lots of bright lights. So the brain has to be told that the sun's gone down somehow. So in that hour before bedtime, we lower the lighting to give that brain the message that sunset's come. It's time to start relaxing. But sound sensitivities as well. Some children are very hypersensitive to sound. And in the second half of sleep, we're in a much lighter, environmentally aware stage of sleep. So environmental sounds are going to wake some of our children. And white noise can help with this. White noise is a sound blocker. It's quite irritating. I don't like it. No. It irritates me. But yellow and pink are also sound blockers.
Okay.
You have green, which is for re-regulation, and brown, which is for relaxation. But the white, yellow and pink are really sound blockers. So just having that in the background. And again, our children don't like change. So experiment, have it while you're having your tea. Have it on while they're just playing until you start to introduce it, maybe on the landing while they're getting ready for bed, and then eventually you can move it into the bedroom so that they've got used to it. Just having no sound and then lots of sound.
I wouldn't like that, but I am aware that a lot of those noise blocking sounds are available on a lot of music streaming channels. It's not something that you have to explore.
So easy to find.
Explicitly, really easy to find. Yeah.
And it's best through a speaker, and so they don't have phones and iPads in their room. Yeah. But just put in an Alexa, and a great tip here is if you've got an Alexa, children know how to use those, but you can change the name, and I think it's Ziggy or Echo. I only know those because those are the systems I've got. Other systems are available. But you never give this device vocal instruction. Everything is done through your phone. So if they try to change it, nothing will happen.
Okay.
And just put in, I use YouTube just for an example, just put into YouTube, white noise, 10 hours, and you'll get something up. White noise apps aren't the same as white noise, so just make sure it's pure white noise if we're sound blocking.
Okay.
Some children these are our ADHD children who are typical of this, fizzy brains. Can't switch the brains off. So that wind down is really important. Sensory wind down sometimes alongside activities. But listening to something can get them out of their heads and focused on something else. So again, just for examples, Bill Bryson does one of his audiobooks is on YouTube, for example. Stephen Dalton does some really soporific stories specifically for sleep, and they're really descriptive. So they're interesting enough to listen to, but you don't have to hang on and fight sleep to find out what happens next, because nothing really happens. So they're just really gentle stories, and you have them playing all night because that auditory environment needs to be consistent. The other thing to think about in a sensory sense is the bed.
Okay.
So is it comfy? And are their sensory needs being met? So just because I like a soft mattress doesn't mean my child does. I had 4 children, but the third child used to sleep on the floor.
Right, okay.
And I thought it was because he liked a den because it was under his bed. I let him sleep there so his sleep wasn't disturbed. But it wasn't until we went camping and he asked me to take all the air out of his mattress that my light bulb moment was, it's not about being in a den, it's about having that hard floor giving him proprioceptive feedback.
Yeah. And that could feel tricky as a parent. If your child is choosing to sleep on the floor, you might think, oh my goodness, what's going on? I'm going to get judged that my child is sleeping on the floor. But knowing that that is a sensory feedback need is a really helpful key bit of information to kind of take away, isn't it?
And it's allowing parents to relax and think out of the box and actually give them permission to be bad parents if that's how they feel they're being. They're not. But we changed his mattress to a harder mattress and he was fine. But proprioception is a word that not many people know. And I always think it's like watching Millionaire. If you know the answer, you're screaming at the telly, aren't you? But if you don't know it, you just think, well, I'm glad I'm not on there. And that's the same. As soon as you said this, they said, why didn't I know about this before? It's so simple. But it's because we do it all day, every day, and they've never heard about it. And it's part of their learning journey, having a child with additional needs.
So it's our sense of ourself and our body awareness and the tactile feedback that we need, that touch feedback that we need in order to feel grounded and to feel ourselves is that sense of proprioception, isn't it?
Yeah, and I often ask parents, tell me about your child. And when they start describing a child who takes the sofa cushions off the sofa and likes to dive onto them, that's when I start thinking, we might have some needs here that aren't being met.
Or they like to squish into small spaces. Or sometimes when I'm doing my interviews as an occupational therapist, children who like to wear clothes that they've grown out of almost because they're giving them that squeezy feeling. And there are often clues in their behaviour that are telling you their bodies really like that sense of knowing where they are in space. And that probably feeling of lying on the floor really gives them that feedback about how they are positioned and where they are in space.
It does. And it might be enough for some children, but for some, there's even more needed. So I often say, roll up some blankets, put them under the fitted sheet so they're right like a cocoon. And also, I send parents links to compression sheets. You can get them now for under 20 quid. They no longer have a special needs price tag attached to them. And children sometimes sleep right under them. Sometimes they just want it up to their neck, sometimes just their waist downwards, but they can choose. And it's almost like having a weighted blanket without that heat and weight of a weighted blanket. And let's just have an aside here. If you are thinking of a weighted blanket, so many caveats. They're not really safe for very young children. They've got to be measured for height and weight. And you've also got to think what they're filled with. Because if we've got children who chew their bedding and we've got black glass beads in a weighted blanket, we don't want our children chomping on glass. So for us, if you need weighted therapy, do it in the hour before bedtime, give them the feedback then. But compression is much better in the bed.
And I think that's my little point where I would raise a little flag for getting some advice from an occupational therapist who does fully understand about weighted therapy and proprioception and how that can impact both positively and negatively for some of our children, because it can be something, that creates arousal. The sensory systems in general, looking at sensory routines, can be something that can promote arousal. You mentioned it just earlier, maybe getting a bath or a shower to us might feel relaxing, but to some children could feel quite alerting. So having that expert knowledge from an occupational therapist, if you can access one, could be super helpful in that respect.
I will always signpost. If you're lucky enough to have an OT, use them. And they could give you ideas for that sensory wind down beforehand. I've got a couple of a parent and a child who have to push the kitchen wall over together. They haven't managed it yet, but that's what they do as part of their.
Lovely idea.
The little girl says, "Right, mummy, it's time to push the wall away."
Okay.
And it's a lovely proprioceptive activity between activities. Sometimes you have to have those sensory breaks. So always use your OT if you have one. They're worth their weight in gold.
Oh, that's a lovely thing to say. I wonder if we could just take a pause now to reflect on a question that's been sent in by one of our parents.
Oh, lovely. Okay.
My 10-year-old son frequently wakes up in the night, every single night, either for comfort or saying he's hungry or needs the toilet, even if he doesn't. Mm-hmm. Am I supposed to give in to his commands, or am I supposed to be strict? I'm constantly exhausted, can't figure out how to be consistent, and I'm struggling to navigate this.
Okay. Poor mum.
Yeah, I really feel for her reading that out.
I know, yeah. And this doesn't sound like it's a new thing. It sounds like it's something she's been struggling with for such a long time. And remember, when we looked at the impact, don't underestimate that impact. It is having a really negative effect on her. But I think when we take the emotion out and what the child's doing, what we've got is a child who's waking up regularly throughout the night. Mm-hmm. So we have to unpick that. There are so many things to unpick here. And if I was doing a new consultation, I'd spend at least an hour chatting. Mm-hmm. So let's just pick out the generic stuff if that's please. Okay. So I'd have to ask, why is he waking up? What's going on there? Children will wake usually for a reason. It's a small percentage of our children who need an onwards referral. Most behavioural things can be unpicked quite easily. So remember, go back to that bedroom environment. Sit there just before your child drops off and have a look around the room and think, and again, go through the senses. What can they see now that won't be the same in a few hours' time when they wake? It might just be something simple like the landing light is on and you turn it off when you come to bed. It might be that they can hear the telly downstairs and then the house is silent. It could be that they have an audiobook on a timer or a light show on the ceiling. It could be that mum lies down with them. This is a really common one. Mm-hmm. And the easiest way to get your child to sleep is to snuggle up with them and then you get up and go into your bed. Co-sleeping, really common. Mm-hmm. So what we need to do is make sure that environment is consistent. Any change in environment is going to activate our caveman brain, who has to wake up and check if that difference is a threat or not. So the first thing is to check that. The second thing is to think, how do I settle my child? And yes, those environmental things are part of that. But if they need something put back in place in order to resettle, we then got what we call an association. Mm-hmm. And that is just a way that the brain is trained in order to go to sleep. Mm-hmm. And we all have them. For me, I have to listen to something, whether it's a podcast or a comedy show. Again, I go to YouTube, find something that lasts 10 hours and just leave it on all night. I used to do things I listen to podcasts on Netflix, but they don't repeat. You can't loop them. So I'd constantly have to wake up properly because my sound environment has changed, and I'd have to find it again, put it on, and then I'd be gone. 2 to 3 minutes, I'm back asleep. So finding something that lasts all night for me means I listen to it, but I couldn't tell you what they said because I've fallen asleep again. And that's because if I don't have it, this starts waking up and I start thinking.
But you don't need another person to then come back in the room. So you're not relying on
our children.
The parent or carer.
Don't have the ability to do that. You're absolutely right.
Mm-hmm.
So what we need to do is remove that association. And again, easy words. So such an easy phrase to say, really difficult to do because we're making change and our children are not going to enjoy that change. And we have to work through that transition. They get used to it, they really do, but consistency is what wins every time. Mm. So she said sometimes he needs to go to the toilet. So if he does, we have to think, is he hydrated enough during the day? A dehydrated child is actually going to need the toilet more. If you've got toileting issues, we always signpost to the ERIC website, lots of information on there. Mm-hmm. Does he have 2 wees before he goes to bed to make sure that bladder is completely empty? Mm-hmm. So there are things that we can do to help with nighttime bedwetting, but sometimes it might go on for a long time. Boys are trained much later than girls. It's quite common for a boy in year 1 and 2 to still be wetting, and thresholds for intervention are quite late. It's surprising how late that normal is deemed as normal. Mm-hmm. So please don't panic. Mm-hmm. Just if bedwetting is an issue, just put a plastic sheet and a normal sheet, plastic sheet and a normal sheet. So when they've wet the bed, you've got literally whip the pyjamas off, put new ones on, take 1 layer of waterproofing off, get them back into bed, deal with it in the morning. Just make life easier. Making sure that those curtains are blocking light out so that early morning light isn't going to wake him as well. Making sure that environmental sounds aren't waking him. Remember, level 2 sleep, which is our second half of the sleep of the night, is potentially going to wake us if there are sounds. I spoke to a girl just yesterday. She's 15, and she said she woke to the sound of water dripping. And we were talking about the caveman brain, and I said, that's woken you because it's not a normal sound. No. And you know, although it's not a threat to you, you know that sound shouldn't be there. And what they discovered was a mouse had eaten through one of the pipes. So it was a sound that shouldn't have been there and was waking her up. So it was really interesting to be able to talk about why that woke her up in the night, and it's fixed now. Her sleep isn't. We've only just started working, but that was one of the sounds that was
one thing
waking
you could
her up.
Tick off the list.
Absolutely, yeah. So that was really interesting.
One thing we touched on there when we were talking about routines and bits and pieces was around co-sleeping. And I wonder, as a specialist sleep practitioner, what your views are about co-sleeping.
My strapline really is, it's not a problem until it's a problem.
Okay.
We, again, as a Western culture, tend to want our children in their own rooms, in their own beds, and sleeping without us, which is fine. But my youngest was still in my bed when he was 10, and I loved it. He was a real snuggler. His arms went round me, his legs came over me, he played with my hair, and I just loved it, and he was great. Child number 1 and 2, also nice to have. Child number 3, who we've talked about, who had lots of proprioceptive needs, tossed and turned, and I used to be able to catch a fist in my deep sleep before it hit my face. Goodness. I was that tuned into his movements. So he didn't sleep with me, not because he didn't get good sleep, but because I didn't. So one of the questions I will always ask when parents say it's the only way I can get them to sleep, I'll ask, but how is your sleep? Because if their sleep is not good, then they're struggling, and they're not going to be the best parent they can be. They're not going to have the energy, the resilience, the tolerance to parent that child the next day. So although it sounds like an easy option, sometimes it's not the best option, and we'll explore that and see if actually moving a child into their bed is a better option. If everyone's getting really good sleep, and there are lots of cultures that do co-sleep, as long as you're taking sleep seriously and it's safe, there's always the safety aspect. And everyone's getting decent sleep, and life's good if they're co-sleeping, and you don't want to change. It's not my choice to suggest you make that change. It's not a problem.
Thank you for that. And thank you for sharing a wealth of information throughout the podcast. It's been absolutely fascinating. I wonder if we could end today on a myth that you'd like to bust around sleep.
So, a little bit controversial, but melatonin isn't always the answer. Parents think that it's going to solve all of the sleep issues. It's not a long-term solution. It's not meant to be given long-term.
Melatonin is a medication, sorry,
as a supplement. Yeah, well, it's a synthetic supplement. And quite often, my goal, I always ask the parents what their goals are before we start, and very often the answer is we want melatonin. But the services that I work in, we are part of that prescribing pathway, and parents aren't allowed to be prescribed until they've come to us to do the behavioural stuff. But it might help a child get to sleep, but if all the behavioural stuff isn't in place, it won't keep them asleep. And very often they'll go onto it and it won't do anything, and they're quite surprised that it won't do anything. So we know that some children with ASD and ADHD don't make the right levels of melatonin, but it's not all of them. So if we can make sure that we've ironed out all the behavioural stuff, we know that we've tackled all the sleep issues, we've looked at all the sensory issues. Very often we improve sleep to the point where parents say, no, I'm all right with this. I'm happy with what we've got. We don't need to onward refer. Should we know that we've tackled everything we can, we then have evidence to go back to the consultants and say, no, we've tried all this, we've addressed the sensory needs, we've looked at the routine and the timings, we've looked at the bedroom environment, we've done that wind down, things are still really bad. And that's when they can suggest a trial. And it is a trial. And if it makes a difference, brilliant. If it doesn't, perhaps we need a further onwards referral to see if there's a sleep disorder.
Helen, that's been absolutely fascinating. Thank you so much for sharing all your knowledge today, and thanks for joining us on SENsational.
You're welcome.